Hey listener, Leslie here. Before this final episode of the Wild Turkey Conservation miniseries kicks off, I just want to remind you, listen to the entire thing, all the way to the end. There are surprises down to the final 10 seconds. All right, here we go. This is Niche to Meet You and the final episode of our miniseries about the wild turkey conservation niche. You'll discover why it even matters, why it's important, and how the wild turkey is changing the world. I'm Leslie, and it's Niche to Meet You.
I have read many definitions of what is a conservationist, but I suspect that the best one is written not with a pen, but with an axe. It is a matter of what a man thinks about while chopping, or while deciding what to chop. A conservationist is one who is humbly aware that with each stroke, he is writing his signature on the face of his land.
That's the wild turkey conservation niche's very own historian, Brent Rogers. You've heard his voice already. He writes books about the subculture, including his recent about how the restoration of the turkey brought about an entire industry of call makers and innovation. The quotation you heard him reading is from the book A Sand County Almanac, Aldo Leopold's seminal work on conservation that contains his land ethic. It's been mentioned a couple times in this series, and Brent reads it annually. He feels a connection to the author as a fellow Iowan. Aldo is the father of modern conservation. He was an inheritor of the philosophies of John Muir, the founder of the national park system. Aldo developed what he called a land ethic. It's the idea that to consider what's best for Homo sapiens is to consider what's best for soils, waters, plants, and animals. It was an enlarging of our community to include all of the land. Aldo pioneered managing game species using scientific evidence and ethics. He writes, "A land ethic changes the role of Homo sapiens from conqueror of the land to a plain member and citizen of it." Aldo was one of the early developers of the wildlife management discipline. He redefined what wilderness meant. At a time when wilderness meant a place to hunt and cultivate for human good, he saw it as a place to respect and keep not just for human good, but for the good of all species, which meant there would be times when hunting was not the way to solve a problem. It was indeed a tool to be used wisely. He taught his students to look for, quote, the beauty as well as the utility of the whole, and know the two cannot be separated, end quote. This ethic and position was a new idea at the time, but in the context of American history, it wasn't new, of course. It wasn't original. It was a borrowing, and it should sound familiar to you. Leopold's land ethic is permeated in the principles of the native peoples, and this is no coincidence or accident.
When he started his career in 1909 as a forest ranger, he had been educated at Yale, which was, I think at that time, one of the, or perhaps the only school of forest management.
This is Dr. Joshua Bellin from La Roche University in Pennsylvania. He teaches a course called Aldo Leopold, Native Americans, and the Land Ethic.
So he goes out west after getting his degree at Yale, and he himself had a very, I would say, utilitarian perspective toward the land and toward forest management. And if you look at some of his early writings, that's really what he's saying. But around the mid-20s and 30s, he starts to move in the direction of thinking about the ethics of land management. Are we respecting the land and the creatures that inhabit it? Some of that has to do with the rise of the ecology, which was the study of the whole system of organisms and the networks. But he was around native people the entire time he was in the Southwest. That was 15 years.
Though Aldo's writing and work ended up sparking a modern environmental ethic, he initially espoused racist attitudes toward indigenous peoples. But over time, it becomes clear through his essays and writing, and ultimately in the development of his land ethic, that he learned from and grew out of these initial assumptions.
But I think what Leopold started to realize was the reason the land was healthier in some of those regions than in regions of the U.S. was that it had been managed better by the indigenous people who had inhabited that land for thousands and thousands of years. He has one quote where he basically says that the people who have preceded us in the Southwest have managed to live on the land without damaging it, without destroying it. And he says we're moving in a direction where we're destroying it.
Aldo adopted the principles that governed these Purple Mountain majesties long before the Europeans invaded the eastern and southern borders. His important work is a reorientation to the indigenous posture of reciprocity and natural cooperation.
This really comes out for Leopold in one of his more famous essays, Thinking Like a Mountain, where he talks about hunting wolves. And where he talks about a very early experience that he had. He and his friends were out hunting, and they downed a mother wolf that was crossing a river with her pups. Then he describes this very powerful experience of looking into the eyes of the wolf, and as the wolf died, recognizing that there was something in those eyes that he had never taken into account before, whether you call it wisdom or some sort of idea about the land and how to inhabit the land. His training and the orthodoxy of his time was eliminate wolves, eliminate mountain lions. In that essay, Thinking Like a Mountain, he represents this idea that eliminating wolves in order to presumably produce more deer for hunters may be a grievous error. When you eliminate wolves, you have lots of cascading effects down the ecological pyramid, as it's sometimes referred to. And that's where he started, I think, to really articulate this idea that interdependence is an important way of thinking about the land. Any creature, whether it be wolves or in the case of what we're talking about here, wild turkeys, has an ecological role to play.
Aldo Leopold died in 1948. He had a heart attack while fighting a wildfire on his neighbor's property. The same year, indigenous peoples got the right to vote in the areas he served 20 years prior. The next year, 1949, a Sand County Almanac was published. Now, let's get back to our beloved turkey, shall we? It may seem like we're all alone in the woods without having heard a single gobble in quite some time, but the chess match is only heating up. The same year, Aldo Leopold died, 1948, a man named Tom Kelly graduated with a degree in forestry, a field Leopold both studied himself and reinvented in his lifetime. Tom Kelly should sound familiar. We talked about him briefly in episode 2. Heard his voice. It's highly likely that Tom would have known of Aldo Leopold. It's not a stretch to say that he may have studied work Aldo had been part of pioneering for decades. Brent Rogers' research on the early days of the formalized turkey conservation movement finds that early murmurings began around the time Tom Kelly entered into his professional forestry career.
So politicians and landowners and conservation organizations, academics and biologists all came together and in 1959 had their first wild turkey symposium and said, we understand there's a problem and these are the tools we need to fix it. And they got busy and started to do that. So then decades later, it could be handed off.
This generation of hunters and environmental workers, those like Tom Kelly, that inherited Leopold's land ethic, worked to bring the whole of nature's best interest to the center of the conversation rather than merely humankind's interests alone. Tom Kelly would go on to write the most important book in the culture of the wild turkey called 10th Legion. It's about the tradition and importance of turkey hunting, but borrows the style and tone of Aldo Leopold's writing and infuses it with wit and humor.
It is, of course, a cult, and like all cultists, we tend to be fanatics. A cult whose members are mostly wet, often cold, and usually unsuccessful. We will be delighted to have you.
The writing, and the book that came from it, brought an entire generation together to solve a problem. And it all seemingly came from the willingness to adopt and appreciate a new perspective. In 1973, Kelly published 10th Legion. You know what else happened in 1973? The official founding of the National Wild Turkey Federation. In the course of researching this project, I became increasingly interested, maybe even a little obsessed, in a particular aspect of the story. It's the phenomenon of two politically opposed people groups coming to agreement, solving a problem, mending a gap. But it's a real conundrum, right, this whole thing? Because our population continues to increase. We do have practical needs. Aldo recognized this.
Leopold would never have maintained that that means that you have to take a completely hands-off approach to everything and never touch anything and never change anything. He recognized that that was unrealistic and that human beings need to draw on the resources of the land as well, but at least to take a more measured approach.
So how do we accomplish a measured approach? Some have turned to veganism or have become vegetarians. Some have devoted their lives to farmsteading and knowing intimately where their food comes from. No matter what, I've learned through this project that it's all messy.
We have not improved on creation, right? Creation had it right. Everything we've done since then has been an effort to augment that, and much of it we haven't got right. And what we, I think, need to do is make sure that we're not trying to manage things in isolation of people, but along with people. And that's what will make it sustainable, is being able to understand how is what we're doing having an impact, and what is it that we can and can't do. And that's conservation, which I think is just acknowledging that fact that we have to coexist. We can't exist, separately.
Even this philosophy is an inheritance of the dichotomy of the native practices of living off the land while revering it. It's complicated, to be sure, it's nuanced, but it's important, though a seemingly unsolvable riddle. And the wild turkey conservation story gives us some keys to this puzzle. After this break, we look closer at these clues to find how it's relevant to us here and now. Be right back. Okay, before we get to the final half of the last episode of this miniseries about wild turkey conservation, I just want to say one more time, it is no small thing that you have decided to spend time with this miniseries. If you're binging it right now, awesome. Wow, that's amazing. If not, still, wow, that's amazing. Thank you. All I want to do in this moment is to just say, if you like it, tell a friend. It's that easy. That's going to help us get the word out about Niche to Meet You even more. It helps us more than ratings and reviews, though if you want to do that, I will not stop you. Okay, let's finish this thing, shall we? Take my hand. Off we go. In my conversation with Josh, I wondered what it was about Aldo Leopold that took him from being a student of his time, where he was taught to control the land, to harness it, and then ended up a prophetic voice promoting indigenous practices and principles.
He was always learning, and he was always willing to learn from whatever circumstances he found himself in, whether that was the trips to Mexico, whether that was living among indigenous people, whether that was when he was up in Madison. And he learned so much from that experience, the experience of actually having really, really unhealthy land of his own that he and his family had to groom back to health. Throughout that life, he just kept changing. He never was satisfied to say, well, I'm good. I've learned as much as I need to. This is working for me. I'll just stick with it for the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years. He was always open to influences from others, being open to other people and listening to other people. That's something that I think he never failed to do throughout the course of his life.
It's this kind of posture that enabled the wild turkey conservation movement to succeed, and it provides immense importance for us now. And here's why. This series was produced in summer of 2024. On July 5th, in the dusk of the morning, with residue from neighborhood fireworks lifting from the dew-soaked Tennessee countryside, I was drawn to an article by Olivia Rutigliano about the movie Jaws and its philosophical significance. Now you might be asking what Jaws has to do with wild turkeys. Just hang on, it's coming, I promise. The circumstances surrounding the hunt for the killer shark mirror many of our own current circumstances. Politicians saving face, consumerism, uncontrollable nature that rages and destroys. Olivia points out the obvious comparison of Jaws to Herman Melville's novel about Moby Dick, a character I've mentioned in this series already because there's a resemblance in hunters looking for the wild turkey, like Ahab chases his whale, in that you can't know where the creature is, but it knows where you are, and ultimately it's in control. So when I read this article, I initially delighted in the shark as a comparison to my newfound turkey companion. But then I noticed something else. The article notes that the quest for this shark brings three very different people together. A cop who knows politics, a biologist who knows science, and a grizzled sailor who has a lifetime of experience with the beast. These three probably never would have found their way to be on a boat together, except for this singular goal: a shark. But not just a shark. A shark surrounded by high stakes. And the three hunters are there for wildly different reasons. Though the agendas differ, I wonder if they may not actually be in opposition, though they are culturally dichotomous. Over time on the boat, through storytelling and living in a small space together, the boundaries of their antagonistic philosophies meet and soften. They, on opposite ends of their own spectrums, lay down their agendas and compare experience without expectation. And they did all that in the process of chasing a creature. Do you see what I see? These characters feel a lot like some of the folks we've met in this miniseries about wild turkeys. Varied. Perhaps we might assume they're opposed. But they've all recognized that there have been missteps and know that something has to change. They see a problem, though maybe from different angles.
If you can see the past and you can see the future and bring both of them to the present, that's what we need to do. And we need to see what has worked and what hasn't in terms of hunting and conservation if we're going to do it right in the future.
The 70th anniversary edition of A Sand County Almanac features an introduction by Pulitzer Prize-winning author Barbara Kingsolver. Her best-selling books are endorsed by the likes of Oprah. Kingsolver grew up in rural Kentucky, still lives in Appalachia. She's deeply enmeshed in both rural and mass culture. She's very familiar with Leopold's work. She calls him a part of her inner circle, even though he died before she was born. The introduction she wrote brings a modern yet informed perspective to the book. And while Leopold himself makes no mention of oppositional politics in the debate on our environment, Kingsolver does.
Environmental news is mostly terrible, and the word environmentalism has become a civic hand grenade. You'd think that two camps calling themselves conservationists and conservatives might find some overlap, but no such luck. We hurl insults, scuffle for control of the helm, and mostly do nothing while Rome burns. Or rather, as I write this, Californian forests and much of Australia.
She goes on to draw the analogy that one side of the environmentalism debate sees the world as a garden we can reap to our advantage, while the other sees it as a living home in dire need of long-term protection. With the release of these episodes in summer of 2024, it can seem that no one with differing opinions sees each other in any light other than dimmed at best. It can indeed seem that we cannot relate to one another. In the Wild Turkey Tale, I think we've found a story of relating, an example, communing across difference. Somehow, they've learned to trust each other.
I think by them being together in a room, they begin to gain an appreciation and understanding that the hunter is not just about the harvest, that it's about the habitat and the wildlife. And the environmentalist, they start realizing that those hunters have a really unique perspective. So there's a lot of commonality that they can bring together. And by working together, we have a lot better results in protecting, preserving, and restoring wild areas.
The founding of the National Wild Turkey Federation in 1973 was an example of this theory in practice, when seemingly opposing forces worked across divides to listen, share, and collaborate.
they helped get all the states talking together. And actually what we did as early as anybody can remember is we created what's called the Turkey Technical Committee. And this got together all the turkey biologists from across the country and allowed them to share the information of things that they had learned, things that they were trying to figure out problems about, and allowed now there to be a better dissemination of information across borders, where before everybody's kind of working in a vacuum.
And what they discovered is that when you do what's best for the wild turkeys, you improve the habitat for everything else, too.
The benefits of what we do impact things far greater than just the wild turkey. So the work that we're doing is we're trying to make sure that there's proximity to good, clean, abundant water. So that's helping communities. We're trying to make sure that habitats are resilient to catastrophic wildfire in parts of the country. Again, the more work that you're doing for healthy habitats, the more other species benefit. And so when we're doing habitat work for turkeys, the tortoises are benefiting, the red cockaded woodpeckers they're benefiting, pollinators are benefiting, because what's good for turkeys, you need good bugging habitat, flowers, native grasses, things like that. So it's good for pollinators.
In the wild turkey conservation niche, you'll find social conservatives and liberal environmentalists. Those who hunt the bird must appreciate, respect, and participate in the efforts of those who wish to save the environment. And those who value the preservation of habitat for all nature must appreciate, respect, and participate in the earnestness of those who hunt them. Now, stereotypes are only so helpful, right? These social groups are not monoliths, and they are not clearly divided along lines. Regardless, the dynamics at play are in a symbiotic relationship that requires all participants to join the dance.
We listen and take our truths, all of us, from people we trust, who know us, and who have our best interests at heart. This is a built-in bias of the human psyche and the crux of the fix we're in as we stand in nations divided against themselves. As long as we live in entirely separate worlds without comprehension of the other's language or daily grinds, the door between us is sealed. Not a word will pass from one side to the other.
This is reminiscent of the relationship of the indigenous people to the land, the principle of reciprocity that folks like Stephanie Colty, Mary Wiyaki, and Cindy Yohola shared. The philosophy in practice takes an appreciation of everything within a social ecosystem and an understanding that diversity is necessary for survival.
We need to appreciate diversity, being thankful for the different perspectives that everybody brings, and that is valuable to the table when we're sitting down and talking about how to move forward and preserve our environment. And those perspectives are very valuable, and we just need to find the common ground and work toward things. And sometimes you give and take, and so sometimes you don't 100% agree with something, but there is a benefit that is gained. And some of that benefit is inclusion of more people that you bring into the outdoors. So it's a balancing act.
The wild turkey conservation niche serves as an example of how all parties realized that in order to get the thing they wanted, they had to embrace the diversity and care, I mean really care, about what seemed to be the opposite of what they wanted. They had to really care about the work of the other party because the job could not be done without them. And the truth is, what they wanted was at the heart of what the other party wanted too. Remember that viral Instagram reel of mine, the one with Billy? One of the top comments is from a self-called leftist eco-nut. She said that hunters are some of the biggest wildlife and nature fans and allies in conservation that she's ever met. She said that the, quote, "Yee-haw good old boys," end quote, are the ones running litter pickup, park, and trail maintenance, and are supporters of folks like her. Brent Rogers was adamant about this too.
What is great is we all really, in the end, want the same things. We want to keep the things that we consider valuable. There's political pieces that run through it, but because we all, in the end, care about the same thing, I think if we're working towards the right thing, that's where we can get together on it. So, for instance, improving habitat for wildlife, everybody's pretty much for that. I don't know who wouldn't be for that in principle. being able to hunt. Not everybody's for that. But when the people that want to hunt are the driving force behind making sure that habitat for wildlife is improved, it certainly gives you not just a vote, but a stake in it. And that's where I think we've been able to work together even outside of political norms, because people just can't deny that there's not only is there a passion there, but there's blood, sweat, and tears invested into it. And as you talk to the biologists and folks like that, that's what they do. They pursued those careers because it's what they wanted to do. And I very much admire them. As a hunter, I think we all just give according to our ability. We share food, we share water, we share land. Conservation is very much about that. It's just acknowledging that we're all living on the same green orb together.
Aldo Leopold wrote, "No important change in ethics was ever accomplished without an internal change in our intellectual emphasis, loyalties, affections, and convictions." It's very easy to assume that it's not possible to work together, that the gap is too large to mend. There have been too many examples of it not working. When we mostly see that sometimes, even with shared history and love, the best way to respect another person and their wildly different ideals is to create space, widen the gap between us. But maybe what the wild turkey shows us is that sometimes there are places where bridges can be built. Now, this is not a rule that covers all issues for all people. There are moments and situations in which there may not be common ground at all, or relatability, or frankly should offer compromise. I get that, and I don't know what to do with that conundrum. I'm sorry to say, a podcast won't offer you answers. I wish it could, and I really wish I could be the one to do it. To assume I could would be naive at best. It would be impossible. What is possible, though, is to tell stories that contain nuance, like the nuances we found in the wild turkey conservation story, in the Native American posture toward land, which inspired a man from Wisconsin to instill practices that led to the rescue of a beloved bird. Maybe just hearing about gaps being mended in one corner of the world will give us a little bit of relief. Maybe the weight on our shoulders can be a little lighter. Maybe it can even bring us, dare I say it, hope. Then no, this is not easy, nor is it simple. But for those who love and appreciate the wild turkey, it's happening every day. For as Barbara Kingsolver says,
to adapt ourselves to an existence that honors both our needs and our fellow species for all of time is to honor that which is godly in ourselves.
Now, you may wonder what the turkeys think of all of this. It's kind of odd that the main character in this story has been completely silent, except for maybe a couple gobbles. We did reach out to them for comment, but as of the writing of this episode, 6 months after I began my journey into the story of the wild turkey, I still have yet to see a single one. Not on the side of the road, not in a neighborhood, not in a field. Not a single one. Like I said, turkeys are like Bill Murray. They're playing a chess match with me, and they're winning. I fully expect that soon after this series releases, I'll look out my front door on a cloudy day and see one in full strut, spitting and drumming, stomping as the ground shakes beneath it. Maybe it'll even start to rain. Checkmate. The Niche to Meet You project and the stories we tell are lovingly crafted for you by me and my storytelling sidekick and editor, Chris Thiessen. The music you heard was composed by Abigail Flowers and arranged by Zach and Maggie White. Additional music was provided by Blue Dot Sessions. Our art is by Rachel Hardiker, and our mastering is by Kevin Morris. Finally, we want to thank Laura Bates and Tom Kelly for allowing us to use 10th Legion audiobook files. You can read more about the Niche to Meet You project and all of the wonderful niche interests we cover at www.nichetomeetyou.show. Thank you for listening. It has been so very niche to meet you.